In this video, we're going to talk about the prevalence and trends in substance use, both worldwide and with a little focus on the United States. So first, let's talk about some good news, because we always should talk about the good news before the bad. So the good news is with tobacco smoking. In 1990, about a third of men worldwide and over 8% of women worldwide were regular smokers. And as we all know, tobacco smoking in particular is associated with hundreds of different diseases and is still like the number one leading cause of morbidity and mortality. By 2015, so 25 years later, we're down to 25% of men worldwide smoking and 5.5% of women worldwide smoking. So this is a success story. By reducing the number of men by a full 10 real percentage points, and women by 3 real percentage points, that's really a great public health victory. When we talk about alcohol use, this isn't really a pro or con thing, but it is worth noting that the majority of people in the world don't drink. The prevalences vary based on what region of the world you're talking about. Some regions, there's a lot of drinking. A lot of people are at least yearly drinkers, such as in Europe, in the Americas. But then you have other regions which very few people drink, such as the Middle East, Eastern Mediterranean region, and Southeast Asian region. And then among the drinkers themselves, actually a very small percentage are problem drinkers, either heavy drinkers, drinking more than 7 drinks a week if they're female, 14 drinks a week if they're male, or regular binge drinkers, so drinking more than 4 drinks at a sitting if they're female, drinking more than 5 drinks at a sitting if they're male. So if you just kind of take a broad look at it, say about half of the world are current drinkers, say 50% of the population are current drinkers. But among those, only about 15%, in this case 17 and 16%, are actually problem drinkers, where we need to do an intervention to treat them in some way, shape, or form. And again, there is a lot of variation both in World Health Organization regions, there's a lot of variation between countries, and even a lot of variation in the United States itself. It is a big country, there's a lot of states, and each state act much differently than each other. And what's interesting about these charts is that you have geographic variation both in binge drinking, which is important, that's the lower right-hand chart, where you have higher prevalence of binge drinking in Midwest states, and lower prevalence in southern states, which is interesting. But you also have different geographic distributions of the type of alcohol consumed and the amount of that alcohol consumed. So you have higher beer consumption in Montana and North Dakota per capita. You have greater wine consumption in California and Nevada. And you have greater spirits consumption in Nevada, Wyoming, Wisconsin, and New Hampshire. So even the type of alcohol has different variations in terms of how many people will consume it. Overall, about 5% of the world has consumed an illicit drug, an illegal drug, in 2015. Those are the most updated numbers that I could find. That's still hundreds of millions of people. So it's not like, even though the percentage is very small, it's not like there's only a few people hanging around doing drugs. Among all of these illicit drugs, marijuana use is by far the most prevalent, with over 180 million people worldwide being regular cannabis users. The second most prevalent drug does vary by region. Again, there's a lot of geographic variations in terms of substance use, both legal substance use and illegal substance use. But among these second most prevalent substances that are used worldwide, you're talking about opioids, including prescription drugs and heroin. You're talking about amphetamines and other stimulants, ecstasy, MDMA, and then cocaine. But similar to alcohol use, only a very small percentage of illicit drug users are actually problem drug users. The majority of them, the vast majority of them, are trial users. They want to see what it's like, but they don't keep using it. They might use it once or twice, but essentially they're not addicted to that specific substance. So about 11.5% of drug users themselves were considered problematic drug users. Again, problematic indicating that we'd have to do some sort of intervention to get them to reduce their use or quit entirely. And while 5% of the world's population might use an illicit substance, only 0.4% of the world's population is actually a problem drug user. So instead of hundreds of millions of people worldwide using a substance, now you're talking tens of millions, if that at all. But the thing to remember from this little nugget of information is that even though a very small percentage of illicit drug users are problem drug users, they consume the vast majority amount of all substances out there. So this 11.5% of drug users consume the majority of illegal substances in the world. In the US, we currently have an opioid epidemic. There is an epidemic of people who are addicted to opioids, principally caused by an excessive number of prescription opioids given to people who don't necessarily need it to treat their pain. There's also lack of options to get people off opioids once they're no longer dealing with their current health crisis. This is largely a US phenomenon. About 80% of all prescription opioids in the world are consumed by the United States. And while the United States is a large country, it only makes up about 5% of the world's population. And this is a huge disparity. So in the US alone, there's about 2.5 million opioid users. And again, a large percentage of these opioid users started using substances due to prescription opioids that they got addicted to, and then either use prescription drugs in a non-prescription way, or actually switch to heroin or other opiates out there to basically solve their cravings. About 12 million adults in the world were injection drug users. Now, injection drug use is typically seen as the most dangerous form of drug use because it has a lot of other harms associated with it and not just the substance itself, and we'll talk about that in a different video. This is about 0.2 to 0.3% of the world's population. Again, not all of these users are problem drug users. They could be one-time users, or just, again, they're experimenting. They're more those trial users. But again, there are wide regional variations. You see high rates of injection drug use in some countries and lower than others. Russia, for example, has high rates of injection heroin use, which is higher than other areas in other countries and surrounding regions. So generally, what are the take-home messages? So generally, men are more likely to use alcohol and other substances than women. The exception of this might be non-medical use of prescription drugs, which men and women might be able to access equally. Men are more likely to be problematic drug users than women. Although this disparity, this gap is shrinking in many parts of the world. This isn't necessarily a good thing. It would be good in the sense that there's fewer male problematic drug users. It would be bad if there were more female problematic drug users. So we would have to kind of go into the literature a little more to figure out whether this gap is a good gap that's shrinking or actually a bad gap in terms of overall prevalence. And then the people most likely to be a problem drug user are young adults and middle-aged adults. This is both because these are the times immediately after kind of that initial experimentation age when people are being addicted and maybe not have had the impetus to actually quit or reduce their use. It's also a bit of a case of just kind of maturation bias, as in kind of longevity bias, where the people who are living longer are less likely to be problem drug users because problem drug use increases your mortality risk at younger ages. So there's a couple factors that play into this little this prevalence itself.